What's up, everybody? It's the Inhuman one here, and on November 21st, 2022, I became the world's first to beat God of War Ragnarok using only bare fists. The latest installment in the God of War series just released on November 9th, and I knew that I wanted to experience the game in its fullest. But as a full-time content creator and streamer, I knew that November was going to be a busy month with a solid lineup of games coming out in rapid succession. This is what drove me to attempt a challenge run on my very first playthrough of Ragnarok. If any of you are familiar with my streams, then you already know that I normally go in blind and develop a strategy along the way. However, one major difference was that I hadn't played God of War since the previous game's release in 2018, so I had to learn the mechanics and master them quickly if I was going to be successful. So before we start chronicling my journey through the 9 realms and towards the inevitable Ragnarok, let's go over the rules and parameters that I was bound by. Number 1. I cannot deal damage using anything other than my fist when playing as Kratos. Number 2. If I am forced to play as any other character such as Atreus, then I must only deal damage using the melee equivalent for that character. Number 3. Weapons or projectiles can only be used for traversal or to solve puzzles. Number 4. Finishing moves are acceptable and welcomed. My experience with the previous installments taught me that some bosses or enemies could only be destroyed through a quick time event finisher, so I want to be prepared just in case. Number 5. The only exception to the above rules is when our hands were forced due to glitches, scripted events, or in-game mechanics such as tutorials that prevent us from dealing damage using only our bare fists. And just to add a little more of a challenge, I decided to avoid most side quests or favors to avoid over-leveling and to save time in hopes to become the world's first to complete this challenge. The difficulty I chose was the standard Give Me Balance, which is pretty much the same as normal. So with that out of the way, I took my first steps in Midgard and felt the cold frost of Fimbulwinter biting at me. After I reacquainted myself with the controls, I was ready to take on the matter at hand, which was finding Atreus, who was mourning the recent death of his wolf Fenrir. This beginning section proved to be very easy, so I wasn't at all worried about the viability of Kratos' damage at this point. As we followed the tracks, we bumped into our furry friend Bjorn, and this was the first point I realized how important it was going to be to master parries and dodge rolls. Bjorn had an incredible amount of health, so this fight took a while. After we defeated him, Atreus and Kratos returned home and were confronted by none other than Thor and Odin in the flesh. To be honest, this brawl with Thor was far easier than our previous fight with Papa Bear, but it was much more epic. The cutscene started out with Kratos chopping into Thor's belly, but hey, my hands weren't even on the controller, so I was still well within the parameters of my challenge. I learned 2 things from this fight. 1, I needed to master parries fast, and 2, the kick was worthless, so I would resort to using the light attack combos almost exclusively for the remainder of the playthrough. After I paid my blood debt, I met back up with Atreus and started to head towards our home away from home. After a bit of exploration, I encountered some incredibly powerful enemies that gave me the first bitter taste of doubt. If you've ever played the game, then you know exactly who I'm referring to. The Hell Raiders are enemies that are protected by a layer of frost, giving them an enormous amount of armor and health. For normal people, all you have to do is attack them using the Blades of Chaos, and the armor is dispelled immediately, making the encounter much more simple. However, I am not a normal people. In fact, I am the Inhuman one, and as such, I have to make things harder for your enjoyment. I probably died about 10 times here and I started to worry, but I had a plan. After the first fight, I knew that their health would diminish, but it would just take a lot more time and patience, so it was here that I decided to master the parry. It was a bit sloppy at first, but I was able to narrowly escape this first hurdle by combining well-timed parries and building up enough Spartan rage to kill these evil bastards once and for all. Unfortunately, I knew that since this new mechanic had been introduced, it was only a matter of time before they threw a whole bunch of them at us. Little did I know that the entire next sequence would be full of the different variations of these super powerful Hell Raiders. It took many attempts, but I was confident that patience, parries, and some other cool P word would help me emerge victorious. The Huntress came out of nowhere, and without our trusty Guardian shield, I barely managed to take her out. Sindri took us to the new safe house, and Brock gave us a choice between 2 temporary replacement shields. I chose the Dauntless shield since the parry mechanic seemed like the perfect match for my challenge, and allowed me to stay on the offensive. I equipped the Fortified Husk because it activated a chance to empower my next attack after successful blocks and parries, and headed to Svartalfheim. The enemies and climate were much more to my liking, and we navigated through a handful of puzzles on our way to Durlin. We hit one minor snag in the road in the form of a scripted tutorial event that taught us about the Ormer, unique creatures that require you to surprise attack them from a distance in order to get their rewards. This sequence taught me that if enemies were present, there's absolutely no way to escape. Every enemy has to be defeated before you can interact with the most lootable items and doors or passageways that allow you to progress to the next section. Sadly, I had no choice but to throw my trusty axe into this little bastard's unsuspecting back in order to break the shackles of the tutorial. After a brief train ride, I faced off with an overgrown Totodile and parried him into oblivion on my second attempt. Soon after, I came across another bump of the road, or better yet a bumpy creature, in a cave known as the Bergsra. This hot mama was no joke, and her explosive little babies didn't make this easy at all. After we took her down, one of her offspring had glitched their way on top of the next cart we were supposed to ride. Now I tried everything, but I just couldn't reach it no matter what, so I was forced to use one of Atreus' arrows to kill the glitchy son of a bitchy. On our journey to locate the legendary God of War tier, we came across an optional mini-boss known as the Hateful. At this point in my journey, this enemy was the most difficult I'd faced off with, and I died many times before I learned his attack patterns and parried his ass to ashes. We found Tyr, who turned out to be a total disappointment, and chased after him as he ran off. Since he was no longer any use as a fighter, we assigned him the honorable duty as chef. Now it was time for some rest, but Atreus had something else in mind, so together with Sindri, they made their way to Freya's hideout. This marked the first time that I had played as Atreus, so I had to get used to the controls and see if melee was even an option. Fortunately, Atreus had improved his CQC skills, and he could use his bow to strike down his foes. I had a feeling that Atreus might bring forth some unique challenges of his own, so I prepared myself for the unexpected. In the next sequence, several enemies were perched on ledges across the way, so instead of pelting them with arrows and failing the challenge, I shot the explosive jars instead. This was technically still within the rules I had set forth, since I didn't deal damage directly with the arrows. And I have to admit that I was really glad that the developers always seemed to leave me with an alternative, or at least that's what I thought. Literally, minutes later, I was ambushed by a group of Draugr, and as their friends fell, replacements dropped in from above. It wasn't until the very last enemy that the AI got stubborn. This Draugr absolutely refused to get down from the ledge to face his inevitable demise, and just shot fireballs from his perch. Unlike his father, Atreus cannot deflect projectiles when he parries them. Instead, they just disperse or dissipate, just like my hope did at this very moment in the challenge. This marked the very first instance that I was forced to use a weapon to deal damage due to unlucky enemy placement, and there was literally no other possible option I had at my disposal, so I had to give in. Now we met up with Freya, and she turned us back with our tails between her legs. We returned back to home base and prepared for our journey to Alfheim to discover Groa's prophecy. With a new realm came new enemies, but the light and dark elves were no match for Kratos' bare fists. Alva was the only elf that proved a challenge, but even she fell victim to our knuckles on the first try. We returned back to Sindri's home with more questions than answers, and needed some well-deserved rest. Atreus was upset that his father wasn't eager to continue forward, and he closed himself off in his room. Atreus woke up in the hidden forest of the giants known as Ironwood and met Angrboda. Even this realm had nightmares, and they had tried their best to stay out of reach of Atreus' melee strikes, but after baiting them into the Talon's range, they were eliminated. As we ventured deeper into the woods, we encountered yet another impasse. This time, not one, but 3 Draugr were just teasing me from their unreachable platforms and peppered me with fireballs. This marked the second instance where we were forced to break our rules due to scripted enemy placement and AI that refused to drop down to their deaths. Eventually, Angrboda fulfilled her destiny and gave Atreus special marbles that held the souls of his people. We took the scenic route back home and explored a nearby cave that happened to be infested with wretches. Atreus must have really been rubbing off on us because we were forced to break the rules again. Well, sort of. One of the 4 required nests was up high on a wall, and we had to resort to using our arrows to damage it from beyond the invisible wall that prevented us from damaging it using our melee attacks. So this was the 3rd instance where we had to bend the rules to progress the main storyline. As we made our way back home, Angrboda's grandmother captured a nearby wolf, and the duo decided that her reign of terror had to end. Atreus and company broke into Gryla's home and attempted to break her magical cauldron, which had the power to sap souls from the forest creatures. But their attempt was foiled, and Gryla was not happy. Sadly, I was even less happy when I discovered that Gam was impervious to melee strikes. I swung my talon bow like a mofo, but sadly I didn't put enough back into it. Now this boss fight was full of gimmicks that required us to use our bow to weaken Gryla's defenses, and then go ham on her magical crockpot. She went down after a while, and Atreus drifted back into dreamland. When he awoke, Kratos was there and then immediately ambushed by Freya in disguise. After a brief battle that ended in a truce, we headed to Vanaheim to break Odin's curse, and stumbled upon an enemy that I was not at all prepared for. The Forest Ancient was a tough nut to crack. Punches didn't do any damage, and even Spartan Rage was not enough to leave a scratch. After several attempts, I realized that he shot two different types of projectiles, a laser and some explosive rocks that came from his chest. Perhaps I could parry these projectiles and deal damage to him. If not, I'd be forced to break the rules. I tested my theory, and it worked like a charm. Each parry dealt a huge amount of damage and even brought the silent giant to his knees. With the forest ancient down, I trudged onwards. The next challenge came in the form of the Noken, an imp that constantly heals any nearby allies. For a moment here, I thought I was going to have no choice but to use a projectile to defeat the Noken, because no matter how fast I attacked, the Draugr's health kept regenerating faster than I could damage them. But I had an idea. If I could increase my DPS, then I could possibly outpace the healing and destroy the Draugr. Since they were essentially invincible, I farmed up some Spartan Rage and pulled it off. Immediately after the Draugr were defeated, the Noken sprang at me from behind and he was dispatched in seconds. The Hateful around the corner required some perfectly timed parries, and Fisk was a complete joke, but at this time I'd become an absolute monster with the Dauntless Shield, so I rose to the challenge and took them out. Nidhogg was next, and despite her massive amount of health, she was taken out first try. I did have to ignite the brambles, but fortunately, I didn't have to deal any damage using weapons and relied solely on my fists. On the way out of Vanaheim, I encountered a new enemy type known as Wisps. Naturally, they were impossible to damage using physical strikes, so without any choice left, I activated my Spartan Rage and took them all out one punch at a time. I returned home to Atreus and had another argument before we got separated again. With Boy back in Midgard, we armed our trusty Talon Bow and swung like a madman. The Wights came in full force and tried to stop me, but I didn't give them a chance. Once I hit them hard enough, they turned into little wisps that could easily be devoured in Loki's wolf form. I met up with Heimdall, who was less than hospitable, and formed a temporary alliance with Odin to put together Jim Carrey's mask. I headed over to Muspelheim with Thor, and we were greeted with more shy Draugr who refused to jump down from their perches. I was forced to use Boy's bow, and it hurt me deeply. This marked the fourth instance the developers forced me to bend the rules. With a new fragment of the mask collected, Atreus returned to his new dad, and Kratos was back in the driver's seat. This was one of the most pivotal moments of my playthrough. As I was taking a break to level my equipment, I noticed a set called Lunda's Lost Armor. I recalled that the dwarf from Vanaheim said that if we returned her orb and found the armor, she would refit it for Kratos. So off we went. This was the only official favor we completed during this entire challenge run. I came across our first Berserker and realized just how amazing my new armor was, especially when paired with the old reliable Guardian Shield. Bare-fisted attacks, parries, and blocks had a high chance to proc poison. Any successive strikes against poison enemies could deal up to 40% more damage as the set bonus. This was the perfect armor set for this challenge, and I was so happy the developers had the foresight that someone crazy like me would attempt this challenge. All was good and well until I came up against a Revenant. This enemy is damn near impossible to hit and she teleports away if you try and attack with any type of melee strike. At this point in the stream, I was about 4 hours in and I was starving. When I get hungry, I start getting motion sickness, so I started getting really dizzy really fast. After about 20 minutes of attempts, I discovered a hidden game mechanic that allowed me to beat her. Essentially, by double tapping L1, Kratos and Atreus use a shield strike that can bypass the enemy's iframes and deals virtually hardly no damage whatsoever. However, with a bit of patience, the impossible fight became a war of attrition that I could win, and this was a huge discovery that I would use against any future Revenants I came across. It was time to forge a weapon fit to kill a god, so we returned to Svartalfheim as Kratos. During one sequence, a wretched nest was preventing the lift from moving, so I had no choice but to use the Leviathan axe to destroy it from afar. Even the explosions from carefully timed parries were not enough to chip away at the nest. And although this wasn't an enemy, it did force us to use a weapon to progress the story similar to Atreus in the caves, so I count this as the 5th violation of our challenge run. Just a few moments later, more out-of-reach wretched nests lined the surrounding area. Instead of giving up and using a weapon, I just kept killing every wretch that spawned, and eventually the sequence came to an abrupt end. It seemed we had smarted the developers this time and avoided using our weapons. I was so pumped that I decided to kill Hard Refill on the way back for good measure, and it was epic. Meanwhile in Hell, Atreus was running more fetch quests for Odin and stumbled across 2 Revenants at the same time. Naturally, I double-tapped L1 until they fell before me. We met back up with Kratos, avoided a scripted weapon usage by attacking the air, and returned to Hell to tame Garm. Garm proved to be an incredible boss fight, and we refused every attempt to deal damage with weapons, scripted or not. In Phase 2, we just had to be more patient than the developers, and we completely avoided using the Draupnir spear. The path to Heimdall was full of superpowered Einherjar and alpha werewolves that we took out after we learned their weaknesses, and at this point in the game, we were very underleveled, and just about every enemy could take us out with 1 to 2 hits, so mastering the parry and dodges was our best choice. Heimdall was quite the jerk, and after we took out his horned lion, I had to discover a method to progress the first phase of the boss fight. At first I figured it would be another waiting game, but after throwing hundreds of punches, I realized that I may have to get a bit more creative. I tested what would happen if I threw a spear in his general vicinity, and luckily for me, he completely ignored them. I detonated the spears, and as they blew up, I was careful to watch Heimdall's health bar. We were in the clear. The spears only caused his stun meter to increase, so once it was full, Kratos was free to punch Heimdall's pretty boy face to a pulp. With the Watchmen dead, it was time for a drink, so Atreus headed to the bar to get Thor, and a fight broke out. There was one scripted sequence that forced Atreus to aim his bow, but I just refused to shoot as Thrud handled all the dirty work. Once Thor sobered up, we traveled to Nilfheim and faced off with a Frost Ancient. Fortunately, Thor was in a terrible mood, and he built up Frosty's stun meter for us to expose its gooey core. We met back up with Kratos, pushed Surtur off a ledge, and killed Hrist in Mist. It was time to siege Asgard. The enemies all had red health bars, which was normal by now, so several well-timed Spartan rages helped us get through this nightmare. This was by far the most challenging sequence in the entire game, and I probably died here more than my entire playthrough up to this point. Loki decided it was necessary to break the rules one more time, so an enemy perched on a ledge played along with his master plan. This marked the 6th and final instance that I would be forced to use a weapon due to scripted enemy placement. It was time to face off with Thor, so I kicked his ass with my hands and loved every second of this battle. In all honesty, the rematch with Thor was much easier than the initial fight back in Midgard, but this was by far the best fight in the game. Odin was eager to finish what he started, so we faced off with the old man and parried everything he threw at us. It wasn't long before we learned his attack patterns, and both phases of the boss fight were over. After a touching scene, Atreus and Kratos parted ways, and the credits rolled. I had done the impossible. I had beaten God of War Ragnarok using only my bare knucks, and I was the world's first to do it. Yay for me. Now if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe. If you ever want to watch me live, then be sure to catch me on Twitch. I stream every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 11 a.m. Central. Also, consider joining my Patreon or becoming a member of my main channel so I can keep creating these videos for your viewing pleasure. And until next time, it's the Inhuman One, signing out.